Hello, boys and girls at home. So today we're going to continue our work with graphing, and we are going to compare and contrast a bar graph and a pictograph. When you compare and contrast, you tell how the two things are alike and how they're different. And we're going to use a bar graph and a pictograph because those are the two that we see most often in third grade and the ones that we're going to be answering questions about. So it's really good to distinguish the features between them and how they're alike and how they're different. So we're going to get started, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And we're going to revisit these two bar graphs that we did with yesterday's or 2 days ago graphing lesson. So we've already answered the questions, and you can see here that we have a bar graph on the top that shows us information about vacation choices. And then we have a pictograph on the bottom that shows children's favorite hobbies. All right, now if you have ever compared and contrasted anything, you might have used a Venn diagram. And so that's what we're going to be using. So today, boys and girls, when you submit your work, you want to complete the Venn diagram, and we'll also be listing the characteristics of a bar graph and the characteristics of a pictograph. You do not need to go back and answer those questions on the graph again like we already did, okay? So let's start with the bar graph and look and see, what do we notice about the bar graph? What are some things that we see on it? Let me get my annotating feature going here. All right, so when we look at the bar graph, what do you see? Well, one thing you see for sure are bars, right? You see all these bars here. We see bars, okay? What else do you see when you look at that bar graph? Okay, something we might overlook, but it's really important, is this thing right here, and that's called the title. That tells us what we're going to learn about or what we're going to gather information on when we read the bar graph. So this particular one, the title is Vacation Choices. All right. And then next, let's not forget one of the most important parts of the bar graph, this thing right here. And that's called the scale. And it's called the scale because it measures how many each category got. All right. And you can see that the scale is labeled number of children. All right. And this particular scale skip counts by 2. So it starts 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So it's skip counting by 2s. All right. Scales will skip count by different numbers. And then last but not least, so we have this label here that says number of children, but we also have these labels down here: farm, camp, beach, city, and theme park. So those are labels. We can also call them categories. Okay. So that's another characteristic of a bar graph. Now, so let's go back or let's go to our next page and list some of those things. So the first thing, let's put a title. So we're going to go down here, and I'm going to have to clear all my drawings. I'm sorry, boys and girls. So I'm going to put Mrs. Reed as my name. So you should put your name as well. And then the very first thing we saw was the title. So we're going to write title here. And remember, the title for that bar graph was Vacation Choices. All right. And then the next big thing we saw were the bars, right? We saw bars on the bar graph. So we're listing the characteristics of a bar graph. Okay, the next thing we saw were those numbers going along the one side. And remember, the numbers measure the votes. So it's called the scale. That's called the scale. And then remember, the scale has a label on it. And at the bottom of the bar graph, if we just flip back here, so you're going to have to read those things through by writing. Okay, so we have the scale here. And then we have a label for the scale here. Yeah. And these categories down here. All right. So the next part, we're going to put labels / categories. All right. So we're going to go, whoops. So we got title, bars, scale, and then our next one will be labels / categories. And again, that was number of children. And then it was all the different categories like farm, theme park, camp, was all those different categories. All right. Now, the last part of a bar graph is probably the most difficult for you to remember, but it will be really important as you get to middle school and start to study graphing and plot numbers on in number sentences on a graph. So we're going to go back up again and we're going to revisit the graph, and I want to show you. Okay, so when we look at this, I'm going to clear my drawings, okay, and I'll go back and retype them because I want to be able to show you. So again, we have the title, the vacation choices. Oh, the vacation choices, why is that not working for me? We have our title, our vacation choices. We have our categories and our labels here. We have our scale here. We have our bars, okay? Now, I'm going to clear all those. The other thing that we have are called the X and the Y axis, okay? So the X and the Y axis are the lines where the two intersect. So let me just show you. So this is one axis and this is the other axis. It makes kind of an L, doesn't it? Well, this axis over here is called the Y axis. And look at a Y is kind of a long or tall letter, isn't it? And this is long and tall. It goes up and down. So that's always your Y axis. And then this axis down here is going to be your X axis. And your X axis, if you can think of the X as kind of a short letter spread out, then that is your X axis. So the Y axis goes up and down like this, like the letter Y. And the X axis comes across like this at the bottom. That's your X axis. So we'll be referring to that. Your scale is typically on the Y axis. That's where you'll typically see your scale. You'll typically see your categories on the X axis, but it's not always like that. All right. So I'm going to clear these and I'm going to go back and we're going to refill in all the parts to the bar graph. And I'm going to type them this time. It'll be a little bit quicker. So what did we say? The very first thing we said was a title. Okay, and the next thing we said was bars. And the next thing we said was, I think, a scale. And then we said, well, and there's also labels / categories. So I don't really care what you call them, what makes the most sense to you. Labels or categories. And then the last one, the thing we just learned about were the X and Y axis. All right. Remember, the X is the one that goes across like this, and the Y is the one that goes up and down like this. All right. So those are the characteristics or the different parts to a bar graph. Now I'm going to clear that and we're going to go back up and we're going to look at our pictograph and we're going to see what characteristics the pictograph has. Okay. So when we look at the pictograph, I noticed something right away. The pictograph also has a title, doesn't it? Children's favorite hobbies. So that's one thing we can make sure we put on the list. It has a title. Now, something different about the pictograph is this thing right here. There was nothing like that on our bar graph, was it? That is called the key. And the key is probably the most important part of the pictograph. If you don't have a key or you don't pay attention to the key, you won't be able to read the data or the information in the pictograph. So the key is a really important part of the pictograph. Okay. Now, the other thing that a pictograph has that a bar graph doesn't have is it has all these pictures or symbols. So the bar graph has bars and the pictograph has pictures or symbols, we can call them. All right. So that's another difference. And then there's something else that we see here. And the bar graph had this as well. And here's what we call, again, our labels or categories. So the bar graph has labels or categories. The bar graph does not have an X and Y axis, though. As a matter of fact, when you look at the pictograph does not have an X and Y axis. And when you look at the pictograph, you'll see it really only has one set of labels. And on this one, it's on the bottom. Sometimes it's on the side, but you don't have two lines on it that are labeled only one. Okay. So now we've identified those. So we saw a title, we saw a key, we saw pictures or symbols, and we saw labels or categories. So I don't see a fifth thing, and that's because a pictograph doesn't have an X and Y axis. So we're only going to write 4 things for the pictograph and the characteristics of the pictograph. So I'm going to clear my drawings, and we're going to head down here, and I'm just going to type these this time. So the characteristics of the pictograph. Well, first of all, we saw the title, right? And then we looked at, really important, the key. And I'm going to put a couple asterisks after that because that's really the most important part of the pictograph, okay? That's what tells you what each symbol represents. And then our next thing, we don't have bars, but we do have pictures. Oops. We have pictures, or we can call them symbols. Okay, pictures are symbols that represent a certain number. All right, and then again, the pictograph, just like the bar graph, has labels / categories on it. All right, and remember, we have one less thing here because we don't have an X and Y axis on the pictograph. Okay. So again, most important part of the pictograph is the key. And if you don't read the key, you might not get the correct information. So really important to start with the key whenever you read a pictograph, right? Now, remember I told you we were going to compare and contrast. So when we compare something or 2 things, we say how they're alike. And when we contrast, we say how they are different. So we're going to use a Venn diagram. So I'm going to clear my drawings here, my typing. And we're going to slide down here. And here's a Venn diagram where we are comparing a bar graph to a pictograph. So you'll notice there are 2 circles, and in the middle here, they overlap. All right, where they overlap, those are the similarities or the ways the bar graph and pictograph are alike. Over here in this area are all the characteristics of just the bar graph, and in this part of the circle over here, those are all the characteristics of just the pictograph. So let's start with, how about we start with what they have in common. All right, so if we compared our 2 lists, I think we would find that both of them have a title. And I hope you would agree with me. They both have a title. If you look at your lists, you'd see that they both have a title. Another way that they're similar. Well, what did we write down on both lists? The other thing we wrote down on both lists were the labels / categories. All right, and that's the 2 ways that they're similar. So both pictographs and bar graphs have a title to tell us what the graph is presenting, and they both have labels or categories. All right, now let's go over to the bar graph and type something here. What does the bar graph have that makes it different from the pictograph? Well, hopefully you said bars. That's the most obvious thing, right? So we're going to put bars. Whoops. Bars is the most, the thing that sticks out the most is being different than the pictograph. And then if we go back and look again, another thing that hopefully you noticed on your list of characteristics is the bar graph has a scale with those numbers on it that usually has some kind of a skip counting pattern. It might be by 2s or 3s or 5s or 10s, but the bar graph also has a scale. There's one other thing on that list of characteristics of the bar graph. If you can remember what we put in up there, something the bar graph has that makes it different than the pictograph. If you said the X and Y axis, you are absolutely correct. So the bar graph has an X and Y axis. All right, and that's what makes it different from the pictograph. Now let's go over to the pictograph. Well, what makes the pictograph different from the bar graph? A bar graph has bars and a pictograph has, a pictograph has pictures. You could also say symbols. So I'm going to type pictures / symbols. And those are the things that have a value. All right, that makes sense, right? Bar graph has bars, pictograph has pictures or symbols. There's another way they're different though too. Again, if you go back to your list of characteristics, What does a pictograph have that a bar graph does not have? Remember, it's the most important part of the pictograph. And if you go back and read your characteristics, the most important part of the pictograph, the part that a pictograph has that a bar graph does not have, is the key. And again, I'm going to put these asterisks by that because that is the most important part of the pictograph. Okay? All right, boys and girls, that's our lesson for today. So what did we do? We examined the parts and the characteristics of both a bar graph and a pictograph. And once we had our characteristics listed, we used this Venn diagram here to show us how they're similar. And remember, the similarities were here in the middle. These are similarities. And then we showed how they were different, and our differences were out here in the outer parts of those circles. Okay? All right, I hope you found that a good introduction to the differences between a bar graph and pictograph. And then we're going to get started on Friday. You'll be working on questions for a pictograph, and next week you'll be doing more work with both pictographs and bar graphs. Okay? Thank you so much, boys and girls.